Good day, students. I'm Mr. Nance, ninth grade English teacher at Chattanooga School for the Arts and Sciences, and today I'm going to be teaching you how to write a narrative. Not just some namby-pamby little narrative that's boring and nobody wants to read and you're doing because you have an assignment and you need to turn it into your English teacher, but instead a story you can be proud of, and who knows, a story people might pay you money to read. The techniques I'll be sharing with you come from two books that I had when I was getting a creative writing degree, Writing from the Inner Self and Techniques of the Selling Writer. All right, so let's get into it. Step one, brainstorming. You have to think of a experience in your life wherein you had a lot of conflict and some irony. The key to all stories are conflict and irony. Why is that? Because that's the nature of our existence. And stories are about the shared human experience. Although none of you have lived this precise story, hopefully all of you will connect to this story. That's what makes you want to read. As a selling writer, the purpose of your title is to make the reader want to open and read the first page. The purpose of the first page is to pull your reader in where she or he cannot help but turn the page. And we've all had that experience in reading, and that's what we're trying to create. So hopefully I can help you understand how you get off to a good start, and then some of the techniques for creating that throughout the story. Our clear learning targets are that you can write a narrative that adheres to all the criteria on the state writing rubric, which will be shared with you, but that gets a little dull and dry, and this is more, hopefully, a real version of it. I'll be sharing a story with you throughout this that I originally did for an assignment in college in this course, and it got a little publication and things like that. So your prompt is to think of a time where you had a challenge. The best thing to pull out a story like that is pain. Physical pain and emotional pain, and usually the two happen together. So think back to times where you had some experience where you faced a challenge. Whatever you do, don't come up with a challenge that you brilliantly overcame like some superhero. By the way, that never happens in life. That makes it children's literature. It's not even young adult fiction literature, and it's definitely not adult literature, which is what we're trying to write here. In this assignment, I came up with 3 different ones, and then I chose the one I could make into the best story. You notice I said make into the best story. This will be an incident from your life. It's a narrative, but no one's going to tell it exactly like the truth. That's not even the nature of our memory. Once an event happens, we recall it. Later, when we recall that, we're actually recalling our memory of the event. And then after that, we're recalling our memory of the event. So it's okay to use a little artistic license and embellish your story some, but be careful with that. I often see students in creative writing where I have to say, this is your overly idealized self here, and it's just yucky. That's not a real person. I want to read about a real human being. The best part about stories, we learn about life indirectly rather than directly, but they have to be about life. Okay, once you've got that, now how do you create this very real character for this story? This technique comes from Method Acting by Stanislavski, and so you try to think back to that time period. Mine happened when I was 5 years old in 1968. And so that's been a long time ago. And so I have to think back to myself in 1968, call upon those memories, list some things. What was important to me? What did I do with my time? What were my days like? What were the things that I liked, disliked, were confused about? What was important to me? List some of those things. Also recall, what did I look like? What did the environment at this place look like? Jot those things down. Some of those will end up in your story, but you basically create a little outline of the setting, a character sketch of you, and something about the setting, which brings us to the beginning of our story. In this story, I'm going to use an exposition because I'll be telling this story through the voice of a middle-aged man recalling an incident in his childhood and at times kind of sliding in and out between telling the story as a little 5-year-old child and occasionally making authorial commentary. The author's voice will come in and say a few things. And the exposition kind of gets the author's voice out of the way. If you have too much author's voice, it's a bad story. A little bit of author's voice inserted every now and then can really connect the reader to that person and make sure they don't miss the important parts. Okay, so now the beginning of the story. The year was 1968. It was ironically named the Summer of Love. You had hippies putting together big music festivals, stuffing flowers into the barrels of National Guard troops as they faced them down on college campuses because they were rioting as part of the civil rights movement. You had Martin Luther King Jr. and the other 5 members of the Big Six creating the most glorious extension of democracy through a nonviolent means we had ever seen in history, and you had a whole lot of conflict, kind of like 2020. It was a historic time, and so you guys are blessed in that you get to live in a historic time like that right now. That's a side note. But anyway, back to the story. I was living on Weeks Road in Daisy, Tennessee. Population 800. A small little town that seems so much farther away than Chattanooga than it does now. And most people just called it the Sticks. It's where poor people lived. And my street was rather poor. It's one of those weird things when you're a child, you kind of, everything's relative. My street was the extent of my existence. And so that's all I knew to judge socioeconomic status by. And on my street, we lived in a small brick house. Many of my neighbors had trailers. Some had underpinning, which kept the cold air from coming in and making the floorboards extremely chilly in the wintertime. Some didn't, and you could see the little how it was pulled into place by some truck. At either end of my street were some really poor people. They didn't even have indoor plumbing. They had outhouses. So regardless of which way the wind blew in the summertime, you smelled the fecal matter of the outhouse, and it was not too sweet of a smell. A lot of my neighbors had livestock, so the smell of chicken poo was common. The smell of cattle in a field, if you've ever experienced that, it's quite indistinguishable. This earthy smell of kind of a combination of poo and grass and dirt. And so anyway, this was an early spring day, beautiful outside. My father was off at work at a factory. My 2 older sisters were at school at Little Daisy Elementary, and my mother, who didn't work, and myself were at home. Now, my mother had lots of chores. It's not like she didn't work. She was a mother, and so she was busy doing all the chores that she normally does, and that gave me the opportunity to go outside and play and get out of her hair. I remember walking down the steps onto my front yard. Now it looks so small. It's only about 30 feet from the porch of that house to the road, but back then it was this glorious wonderland. I could smell the green grass. It often reminded me of like when you first cut into a watermelon. It's a hard smell to describe. The sky was blue, that vivid blue of spring. A few white wispy clouds floating by, a little breeze. I could smell the blossoms in the wild cherry trees that shaded the front of our yard. And so I'm out in our yard, and I'm looking for things to do like any little kid and wanting to play. As I said, we were poor, so we weren't big on toys, so I was looking around, and I found my father's hammer. And over beside the house, there was a pile of some lumber my dad had cut somewhere and pulled up, and there were some loose nails. And so I occupied myself with a little while with his hammer, hammering nails into pieces of wood and into trees and into the ground. And eventually I ran out of nails. And so I got a little bit bored. Scene.